In the last video where I'd turned famous dogs into werewolves, I mentioned how I'd considered using both Courage the Cowardly Dog and Clifford the Big Red Dog for that episode, but I hadn't gotten around to either of them. I still liked those ideas though, and I got another idea that I really liked in that comment section, so I figured what the heck, let's give this a round 2. Here are some more famous dogs as werewolves. Let's go!
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
When I was asked to scribe a list of werewolves and similar such beings the Van Helsings have encountered, whom are known to be benevolent and in control of their faculties even when in their altered state, I assumed the list would be quite short. But the more I have thought on the matter, the more names I have been able to note down. One I added to this roster was a man by the name of Cassius Clifford Howard, once a worthless, sponging idler of a man who spent much of his time seeking handouts and care from his harder-working extended family. His sister, Margaret Howard, was a hard-working widowed woman, running her home and doing her best to care for her daughter, Emily Elizabeth. With her time stretched thin and no suitor on the horizon to aid the household, she allowed Cassius to care for the girl, and despite his lackadaisical nature, he promised to do so diligently. And when the time came where he was needed most, he admirably did come through. The young girl had snuck out of the house on the night of a full moon, eager to explore the nearby woods, with the bright moon illuminating the darkness. When Cassius came by her room to ensure she was asleep, he saw that she'd gone, and he promptly went out to find her. Knowing much better than she that bad things can happen to a lone wanderer on the night of a full moon. He searched the woods with a pitchfork to defend himself, calling Emily Elizabeth's name, but soon found her, paralyzed in fear, facing down a snarling werewolf. The purveyor of a traveling sideshow named Norman Bridwell carried within him the Lupin's curse, and in his altered state saw the girl as his next meal. He lunged toward her, but in a surprising act of bravery, Cassius leapt in front of her, holding his pitchfork forth. The hound tackled into him, being impaled through its stomach, but also biting directly into Cassius's shoulder. Injured, the wolf fled, leaving Cassius also in a badly wounded state, though by the time he and Emily had hobbled home, his wound had nearly completely healed. Unfortunately, Margaret knew exactly what that meant. It was only the first night of the full moon, and Cassius now carried within him the curse. Not having time to get him far enough away from their hometown, she chained him up in their cellar the following evening to ensure he could not harm anyone. But it was not him they'd have to worry about. He did indeed transform that night, and for the first few hours, the chains held, until he heard the howl of another hound near their home. Bridwell had healed, and having gotten the scent of Emily and the taste for Cassius's blood, had returned to finish his feast. From the cellar, Cassius could hear the front door torn open, and Emily and Margaret screaming in terror, about to become little more than crimson splatters of blood staining the walls of their home. And even through his altered state, the love for his family overtook Cassius's new animalistic desires. He started to grow larger and larger, changing into a red hue. He tore free from his shackles and burst up through the floor, grabbing Bridwell easily in one claw and biting through the opposing hound's torso, killing him near instantly and returning the man to his lifeless human form. Thereafter, Cassius would always transform on the night of a full moon, but into this titanic, altered crimson werewolf, and always with a desire to keep his family safe, instead of seeking prey like many others in this state would. Some say it is because he killed and swallowed the blood of the hound that cursed him, and others more sentimentally believe it was truly love that conquered his curse. But either way, he is surely worthy of joining the list of werewolves that the Van Helsings need not concern themselves with. Now with Clifford here, I was going to go with a simple and kind of just classic looking werewolf sort of design, sort of like what I did with Bluey in the last episode, but the main difference here was that Bluey has a lot of different colored splotches on her, whereas Clifford is kind of just red. So even though the two drawings took about the same amount of time, and I like the pose on this one better, where we're kind of looking up at him a little bit because he's a bigger werewolf, although I probably could have accented that a little bit more. I think that the Bluey drawing is better just because of the color variety on it. This one I did add a bit of color variety that isn't actually present on the original design of Clifford. I added like a furless section of black on the neck just to have a little bit of texture and color variety, and kind of in place of Clifford's black collar. And then, as I often do with creature designs, dragon designs, whatever, I changed the color of the biceps and of the main front part of the torso, like the chest and abs kind of area. And then just add a little bit more movement and intrigue into this one. I added like a little smoke wisp kind of coming up around the character, and I gave this one a bit more movement by having his head kind of flinging off to the side a little bit more. So as I said, pose-wise, I like this one better, but if I'd been willing to change up the design a bit more from the original Clifford, I think it would have elevated this one a little bit more to have some more color variety in there. The next werewolf, or more accurately, next Lycan, is one I first encountered alongside Miss Anneliese Van Helsing as a result of information provided to us by a being higher up on my list of these wolves, Norville Rogers. He and his allies stated that they had recently worked alongside another being much like himself, both in the sense that this young man, named Courage Bog, was a Lycan, able to transform into a wolfman somewhat at will, but also in the sense that, despite his name, he often acted incredibly cowardly, though not without the ability to overcome his immense fears and help those he resided with. He lived in a farm-like abode that was practically in the middle of a desert. The closest town is quite minuscule, and once you have been in this region for even a short while, it becomes abundantly clear why few would want to reside in these lands. You see, there is a dark magic about this place. Norville and his allies learned while they were there that centuries before any people lived in the lands, a cursed orb had been buried somewhere nearby by a cruel and powerful sorcerer. As a result, all manner of dark and twisted creatures became far more likely to manifest in these lands, or to be drawn to them seeking its power. Because of this, Courage Bog, along with his adoptive parents, Muriel and Eustace, frequently found themselves under threat of attack by these creatures. I personally would have picked up and moved a long while ago, but they decided to remain. Largely, I suspect, because Eustace was often too stubborn to even get up from his chair, let alone to orchestrate a move to another town. Somewhat helpful to them, though, was the fact that for as long as Courage had been their son, he'd had the ability to transform into a Lycan, most commonly changing when he is most terrified of something attacking him or sneaking into his home. Meaning he spends the majority of his time in his Lycan form. This state does grant him some enhanced speed and strength and senses, though to be quite frank, he is far from the most physically impressive of Wolfman specimens. He does have one other asset at his disposal, however, an enchanted book called the Tome of Intelligence, which has the ability to speak and answer questions for him about how to handle coming threats. Though its answers are often cryptic or even outright unhelpful. Even still, with all his assets having clear hindrances to them, he has managed to keep his family and home safe consistently. While he still reacts to danger like a frightened hen, it is clear that he has a reliable track record with using his Lycan form for good. And I would certainly state that he is an asset in this form, not a threat. Or my name is Dilworth, which it is not. Now, I had never actually seen an episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog before I was making the last Werewolves episode. I watched a bunch of episodes of Courage for that video, even though I didn't end up using Courage in that video. But I'd still taken a bunch of notes and learned a bunch of things about Courage the Cowardly Dog, and I do think it's a very fun show, though it probably would have freaked me out as a kid. As much as I love horror movies now, I used to be very easily terrified of even not horror movies back then. This werewolf is probably easily my favorite of the video. I like how all the drawings turned out, but this one I just love the freaked out, like, bug eyes on him. Kind of makes him look a little bit like Scrat from Ice Age. But I also really like that when Courage is freaked out, his hair kind of stands up on end all crazy, so that I could just emphasize more with this new fur rendering technique that I've been practicing. Although I will say, in the pose that I gave him, it does kind of look like if you turned it sideways, he's like falling out of an airplane without a parachute or something. Also, for all these dogs, I looked up what type of dog they're supposed to be based off of. Apparently, Courage is supposed to be like a pink beagle. So I referenced that a little bit, but honestly, I didn't pull a ton of inspiration from that. Still though, I really like how this one turned out. Now, frankly, for the last wolf I've added to the list today, I have actively tried to expel the memories of the place he resides in from my mind, as I'd describe the island of Oo as too preposterous to function. The Van Helsings have not returned since their first venture there because they deemed if they attempted to interfere in the various oddity events occurring there, they'd likely create no long-term changes and do no more good than harm. Though they have sent scouts to the island on a few occasions just to ensure nothing has gone tragically wrong on a grand scale. Which would not be surprising to hear had occurred. There are frequent conflicts on this island, often between the reigning Bonnable royal family and an ice sorcerer who'd fled from Imperial Russia after stealing an elemental crown that gave him his abilities. The royal family has their own share of enchanted artifacts and allies, and one of these allies is a surprisingly capable young Lycan by the name of Jacob Finsworth. Outside of his aid of the royal family, this young man lives a fairly carefree life, residing in a home he constructed in a tree. His adoptive parents live nearby, though none of his birth relatives reside on the island, as his true father abandoned him at birth. You see, years after having been abandoned, Jacob would meet his birth father, who admitted that prior to Jacob being conceived, the man had been bitten himself by a mysterious, blue, shape-shifting wolf-like figure, which at first seemed to have done little more than briefly injure him. But, some time less than a year later, while on a boat crossing the English Channel, his wife gave birth to their son, Jacob, losing her life in the process. Over the first night of the boy's life, multiple times he transformed into a yellow Lycan, and both Jacob's father and the crew were terrified that the boy could curse them all, or that he could rapidly grow and kill them in their sleep. They made the paranoid, though admittedly somewhat understandable decision to set the boy to sea on one of the ship's safety vessels, not realizing that they were passing quite close to the mysterious island of Oo. The boy washed up on shore before the end of the night and was found by a couple, Joshua and Margaret. Having lived their entire lives on an isle full of strange creatures and happenings, they were more than willing to raise a child with an unusual curse, and help him learn to manage and control it from a young age. Now, in his human form, the boy has proven capable of protecting himself and others with a various array of bladed weaponry, but his truest power comes forth in his very peculiar Lycan state. You see, not only does he gain the usual enhancements of such a form, but he gains the ability to stretch his limbs incredible distances and even reform them into various shapes. It is still unclear what exactly this creature was that bit Jacob's birth father, causing him to gain these abilities, but the beast is currently on the Van Helsing's list of creatures to seek and hunt, while Jacob Finsworth has proven that the only list he need be put on is the list of benevolent werewolves I am currently scribing. and his presence on the Isle is very much to the benefit of the royal family of Oo, as if the whisperings and rumors we heard while on the Isle are true, in the bowels of their castle rests a very dark and ancient evil that the royals will need every asset available to help defeat if it ever breaks loose. My goodness, Adventure Time has a lot of lore to it. That's another show that I haven't really seen that much of, but I obviously did my research for this episode to learn what I needed to write that, and there is so much going on in that show. It's one of those shows I've kind of always meant to get to, but I don't think it's available on any streaming service in Canada, which is where I live, or at least none of the big ones that I have. But anyway, there was a lot of fuel for some interesting lore in there, and I decided to go the same route with Finn and Jake that I did with Shaggy and Scooby, kind of combining them into the same character. I think it made more sense with what I did with Scooby and Shaggy, but I didn't want to just repeat the same thing of him having a dog that they then get mixed together after the fact. I tried to just combine the two characters into one and mix some elements of their parentage. Then of course design-wise went mostly with Jake's look and put a little bit of Finn's clothing on him. But I figured the fun part about this one was going to be putting it in a bit more of a dynamic pose and having one of the legs kind of stretching out into the back. I probably could have leaned into the stretchy powers a little bit more, but I am quite happy with this one because I feel like I did a pretty good job getting the face of a like pug sort of bulldog kind of look, with the lips being all like bumpy and weird. That was an element I noticed on a lot of the reference images I was looking at. And then keeping his eyes just white like Jake's are in the actual show, I was like, oh, that, I had planned originally on adding some kind of more monstery kind of pupils, but I think just leaving it white made it look even more monstrous. It was definitely fun adding this one in there. Thank you to everyone who suggested I use Finn for this episode, and I hope you all like the result.
If you enjoyed this, you might also like my famous Kids TV characters as SCPs episode, or of course if you haven't seen the first episode of this, you might want to go back to that too. Also, if you want more out of this channel and my artwork, I've got a brand new art book out. I also have a Patreon where you get early access to art and inks from every episode, plus a bonus podcast series, or I've got a Teespring store where you can get posters and shirts and sweaters and stuff like that. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is the idea that you don't need to suffer in order to grow, but if you are suffering, use that as fuel for growth. Every painful situation we go through can teach us something about ourselves, and once we learn from whatever that thing is, it becomes easier to not be hurt as much by other difficult situations in the future. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.